Imagine this. You're standing in a crowded room, but you feel completely alone. Everyone is talking, smiling, checking their phones, sipping their drinks, playing their roles with an elegance you've never quite mastered. You nod when you're supposed to, laugh when it's expected, but inside, something feels off. Not broken, not dramatic, just hollow. A background hum of unease, like a song on repeat you can't quite identify. You've done everything right, followed the rules, set the goals, made the sacrifices. You've cared deeply, too deeply, about approval, about image, about outcomes. But still, here you are, restless, tired, and uncertain why nothing feels real. Now imagine, in the midst of that chaos, a moment of disobedience. You stop performing, you stop pretending, you stop caring, not in the reckless, nihilistic way, but with a strange, elegant detachment, like a sculptor stepping away from a half-finished statue and realizing it was never about perfection to begin with, and suddenly, the room feels different, quieter, slower. The noise fades, the laughter doesn't sting, the tension in your chest, gone. Something shifts and you can't explain it. The world begins to arrange itself not around you, but through you. What changed? Michel de Montaigne would say, "You did." He might even smile at your confusion. This French nobleman who locked himself away in a tower to write essays that wandered like meadows but cut like razors, once hinted at a truth so paradoxical it should have shattered logic. When you stop caring so much, when you surrender your desperate grip on control, identity, status, everything begins to fall into place. But how can that be? Aren't we taught from birth that caring is the very essence of being human? That striving, wanting, achieving, pleasing, mattering is the fuel of life? If you stop caring, don't you risk losing everything? Your drive, your meaning, your relationships, your ambition. Isn't not caring just a polite synonym for failure, passivity, or worse, mediocrity? That's the contradiction that quietly tortures millions. We chase happiness through care, but caring too much makes us miserable. We obsess over outcomes, and yet our anxiety hijacks the very outcomes we long for. We seek connection by bending ourselves into shapes others approve of, and end up lonelier than ever. We pour ourselves into image and effort and drain ourselves dry. What if this pain isn't accidental? What if the very act of caring too much about things you can't control, about roles you never chose, about approval from people you don't respect, isn't a virtue but a cage? What if your relentless effort to be someone admired, desired, successful, isn't noble but neurotic? And what if Montaigne, sitting quietly in his tower centuries ago, staring into the abyss of his own mortality, discovered the only exit from this modern madness before it even began? He wrote about death, not with fear, but with curiosity, about failure, not with shame, but with honesty, about ego, not with pride, but with suspicion. He questioned everything, even himself, especially himself. And in doing so, he found a freedom that today feels almost dangerous. The freedom of detachment, of quiet rebellion, of not playing the game. Not because you're bitter or broken, but because you finally see through it. So, what happens when you stop caring, not in despair, but in clarity? Who do you become when you no longer chase validation like a thirsty animal? What happens to your life, your relationships, your very sense of reality, when the need to prove, impress, and please dissolves into something quieter, truer? You may believe that without caring, everything would fall apart. Montaigne might whisper, no, That's when everything falls into place. But don't be too quick to trust that voice. Because to understand what he meant, you must first uncover something darker, something uncomfortable that hides beneath your daily choices. Something rooted not just in your thoughts, but in your culture, your history, your very psychology. There is a hidden force shaping how you live, love, and lose yourself. And before you can let go of it, you must see it. So the real question isn't should you stop caring. The real question is, what has been silently breaking you every time you cared too much? Let's go there, shall we? You wake up with your heart already racing. Nothing has happened yet. No phone calls, no emails, no conflicts. But you feel it, a tension like invisible thread pulled tight across your chest. You reach for your phone, scroll through a curated avalanche of other people's lives, accomplishments, opinions. You feel behind before the day even begins. And then without consciously choosing it, you slip into performance mode. A subtle tightening of your facial muscles, a shift in posture, a mental checklist. Be agreeable, be competent, be interesting. Play your part. But beneath it all, beneath the smiles, the small talk, the check marks on to-do lists, there's a question gnawing at you. Why do I feel like I'm constantly auditioning for a life that already belongs to me? This is the hidden problem Montaigne intuited long before social media, before capitalism took root in the psyche, before psychoanalysis gave it a name. It's not that you care too much, it's what you care about and why. We live in a world where caring has been hijacked, weaponized, rewired. You're taught from an early age to tie your worth to outcomes, to grades, trophies, salaries, likes, approval, legacy. You internalize the idea that if you don't strive, you won't survive. That the world rewards only those who care enough to hustle, to sacrifice, to compete. But nobody tells you the cost. This isn't just a motivational flaw, it's an existential confusion. Carl Jung spoke of the persona, the social mask we wear to navigate the expectations of the world. It helps us survive, but it also seduces us. We begin to believe the mask is the self. We forget the wild, strange, authentic being underneath, the one who once played without purpose, who once loved without strategy. Over time, the mask tightens, and when it does, something sacred within us begins to suffocate. Friedrich Nietzsche called it slave morality, a system of values designed not to liberate the individual, but to make them obedient. You are taught to be good by the standards of others, to seek praise from institutions and hierarchies that benefit from your compliance. You begin to chase safety over truth, status over authenticity, comfort over depth. What appears as ambition is often just anxiety in a costume. Arthur Schopenhauer, ever the pessimist, wrote that human desire is a flame that cannot be extinguished, only transferred. The moment you achieve one goal, the next takes its place. Satisfaction is brief. Emptiness returns, and so we live in a kind of treadmill purgatory, endlessly chasing the next reason to justify our existence. But what if the treadmill is the problem, not the runner? Montaigne, unlike the other great minds of his era, didn't preach asceticism, didn't write epic systems of metaphysics. He observed. He turned his gaze inward, not to inflate the ego, but to dissolve it. He once wrote, "We are all patchwork, and so shapeless and diverse in composition that each bit, each moment, plays its own game." In other words, you were never meant to be consistent, polished, or optimized. You were meant to be, in all your contradictions, imperfections, stumbles, and reversals. But the culture you live in teaches you to fear that truth. It trains you to control, to curate, to care obsessively about your image, about being palatable, respectable, successful. You become a manager of impressions rather than a liver of life, and that's the tragedy. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that human beings are condemned to be free. We are the only creatures who must invent ourselves, define our essence through choices. But what happens when those choices are made under invisible coercion? When every "I want this" is actually "I was told to want this"? Freedom becomes theater, and caring becomes compulsion. Let's take a sharper lens to this. Consider the anxiety you feel when you post something and no one reacts. The disappointment when your effort goes unnoticed. The quiet fury when someone else gets the promotion, the praise, the applause. These are not just emotional reactions. They are symptoms of a deeper, conditioned belief that your value must be externally verified. But where did this belief come from? Modern psychology points to a concept called contingent self-worth. It's the idea that your sense of self is tied to specific outcomes: success, attractiveness, intelligence, popularity. When you meet the criteria, you feel enough. When you fall short, you spiral. But this structure is inherently unstable. It means you're always one failure away from collapse, one rejection away from self-loathing, one bad day away from an identity crisis. Montaigne sensed this long before it had a name. In one of his essays, he writes, "Ambition is not a vice of little people." He wasn't mocking the ambitious. He was warning them. The higher you climb on a ladder you didn't build, the further you fall when the structure shakes. So, why do you care so much? Because you were trained to. Because the systems around you, schools, careers, media, families, conditioned you to believe that effort equals love, that performance equals acceptance. You became addicted to control because deep down, you fear that without it, you are nothing. But here's the philosophical heartache Montaigne left behind. The more you grasp, the more you suffer. The more you cling, the more reality slips through your fingers, like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. And the cruel irony, the life you crave, the peace, the fulfillment, the authenticity, only arrives when you loosen the grip. But how do you let go of a rope you didn't know you were holding? How do you stop caring in a world that punishes indifference and praises obsession? That's the paradox and the beginning of the path. Because to truly see the cost of compulsive caring, you must face its consequences, not just in your own life, but in the quiet architecture of society itself. And once you see what it's doing to you, you'll never unsee it again. It starts small. You say yes when you want to say no. You compliment someone you secretly envy. You stay late at work even though no one asked you to, just in case someone notices. These choices are subtle, almost invisible. They don't feel like betrayals, but they are, not of others, of yourself. And over time, they accumulate, like plaque on a soul, because each time you betray your truth to uphold an image, something inside you tightens. The mask grows heavier. The voice inside you gets quieter, and you start to forget who you were before the performance began. That's the first consequence of caring too much. You become a stranger to yourself. This isn't poetic melancholy. It's a psychological erosion, a slow, quiet burnout of identity. Modern neuroscience helps us understand why. The brain is a prediction machine. It builds models of the world, of people, of situations, of you, and it updates these models based on feedback. If you receive more rewards, social or professional, for playing a role than for being real, your brain will slowly favor the performance over the person. Eventually, your nervous system doesn't just tolerate inauthenticity, it prefers it. This is why you can wake up one morning and not recognize your life, your job, your relationships, your routines. They were all chosen by a version of you trained to appease others, to play it safe, to be liked, to fit. And it's not just internal. Caring too much breeds a world of artificial intimacy, where conversations are curated, feelings are filtered, and everyone is waiting for the other to be real first. Vulnerability becomes a branding strategy. Authenticity becomes another performance. We start to fear silence, we fear boredom, we fear stillness, because in those moments the scaffolding trembles and the emptiness we've been patching with productivity, stimulation, and validation begins to whisper. The whisper says, "You've built a life around being seen, but no one sees you. This isn't your fault." You've been conditioned by a culture that monetizes your insecurity. Think of social media algorithms. They reward visibility, not depth. Clicks, not contemplation. Image, not insight. Your attention is the product, and your anxiety is the engine. So you keep curating, polishing, caring, and slowly you begin to lose touch with the parts of you that don't fit the narrative. The messy parts, the irrational, poetic, contradictory parts, the parts that make you whole. This fragmentation has a name in psychology: cognitive dissonance. The discomfort we feel when our actions don't align with our beliefs or desires. But when dissonance becomes chronic, it leads to emotional numbing. You don't feel bad because you're sad. You feel bad because you're disconnected. Disconnected from meaning, from your own values, from the kind of life that doesn't require performance to be worth living. And here's where it gets darker. When you live from a place of overcaring, your nervous system stays on high alert. You're constantly scanning, am I doing enough? Do they like me? Did I mess that up? This state, known as sympathetic dominance, floods your body with stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline. Over time, this doesn't just make you anxious, it makes you sick. Studies link chronic stress to inflammation, immune dysfunction, digestive issues, even heart disease. And what causes this stress? The constant need to be enough in a world that's always changing the rules. But the consequences don't end with the body. There's a spiritual death too. When you live your life based on external expectations, you begin to outsource your sense of the sacred. You confuse popularity with purpose. You seek transcendence in trends. You confuse busyness with meaning. And you forget that peace isn't something you earn. It's something you remember. You see it everywhere. Parents who don't know how to talk to their kids without turning it into a teachable moment. Lovers who confuse possession with passion, who cling so tightly to us that both people disappear. Entrepreneurs who build empires but can't sleep at night because the next milestone already feels hollow. Even acts of kindness are infected. We give not to connect, but to be seen giving. We serve not to uplift, but to prove our virtue. And so, the most beautiful human impulses, love, generosity, empathy, become distorted by a silent fear. I don't matter unless others believe I do. This is the rot beneath the surface of modern life, and the culture celebrates it. The harder you work, the more praise you get. The more polished your brand, the more influence you gain. The more you suffer for success, the more inspirational your story becomes. But no one asks what's left of you when the applause stops. Because here's the cruel paradox. You can win the game and still lose yourself. And the most dangerous part, you won't even notice. Why? Because the world is built to reward the performance. It claps for the mask. It incentivizes burnout, perfectionism, hyper-productivity. It makes you feel guilty for resting, weak for doubting, selfish for saying no. So what do? You double down. You work harder. You push through. You tell yourself, once I get there, I'll feel better. But there is a mirage. And the more you chase it, the more reality warps. This is the unseen consequence Montaigne was whispering about. Not just personal discomfort, but the distortion of your entire relationship with life. When you care too much in the wrong ways for too long, you begin to see the world not as it is, but as a stage, a competition, a test. You forget how to be, and worst of all, you forget you ever knew how. But Montaigne didn't stop at diagnosis. He didn't drown in cynicism. He found something else, a way out. Not through apathy, but through a radical form of clarity. Before we arrive there, pause. Ask yourself, when was the last time you made a decision that wasn't about winning, proving, or pleasing? When was the last time you let go, not in resignation, but in trust? There's a rebellion waiting. Not out there, in here, and once it starts, there's no going back. It doesn't begin with a grand declaration. There's no lightning bolt, no fireworks, no viral epiphany. The rebellion begins in silence. You're sitting alone, perhaps after another day of trying to keep it all together, and you feel it. Not a burst of energy, but a subtle emptiness. A quiet question echoing like a cracked bell inside your chest. What if I just stopped caring? At first, it feels dangerous, heretical even. To stop caring sounds like failure, like giving up. But what if it isn't? What if it's the bravest thing you could possibly do? Michel de Montaigne wasn't a rebel in the traditional sense. He didn't storm castles or burn cities. His revolution was internal. He didn't reject society. He simply stopped letting it define him. While other men of his time wrote to impress kings or build systems that would last for centuries, Montaigne retreated to a tower lined with books and began writing essays not to teach, but to understand himself. That was his rebellion. He dared to observe his contradictions instead of conquering them. He let go of the obsession with being right, successful, or admired. And in doing so, he discovered something radical. Peace isn't found by winning the game. Peace is found by realizing the game doesn't matter. But let's be clear, this isn't about apathy. The kind of not caring Montaigne practiced wasn't numbness. It was liberation, a shedding of false obligations, a return to essence. So how do you break free? Not by running away, but by turning inward with curiosity, not judgment. Step 1, question the script. Every day you wake up and follow a silent script. Be productive, be agreeable, be attractive, be smart, be something. But who wrote that script? Did you? Start small. Ask yourself, what would I do right now if I didn't care what anyone thought? Sit with the discomfort. Let it burn. That heat is your soul waking up. This act, this gentle self-inquiry, is an atomic form of rebellion. Because the moment you ask, what do I really want, you begin to loosen the invisible chains. And those chains run deep. As Viktor Frankl wrote, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. But you can't change what you don't see. So first, see the cage. Step 2, reclaim the present. The culture teaches you to live in the future. You chase milestones that promise fulfillment. But Montaigne turned that on its head. He said essentially, I don't care where this leads, I care how it feels. He practiced the art of living now, drinking wine, playing with his cat, writing about bowel movements and nightmares and fear, not to impress, but to understand. He wasn't performing life, he was inhabiting it. That's your second act of rebellion, presence. Try it. Go for a walk without your phone. Eat a meal without multitasking. Say what you actually mean in a conversation, even if your voice trembles. These moments seem small, but they are sacred because they belong to you. And in a world that constantly tries to rent your attention, reclaiming it is revolutionary. Step 3. Embrace uncertainty. Here's the truth most people avoid at all costs. You don't know who you are. You are a constantly changing process, a patchwork of instincts, memories, dreams, and contradictions. And that's not a flaw, it's freedom. Montaigne knew this. He wrote, I do not portray being, I portray passing. He didn't strive to be consistent. He allowed himself to evolve, to contradict himself, to change his mind. You don't need to find yourself. You need to unburden yourself of who you think you're supposed to be. And that requires letting go of control. It requires trusting that you are enough, even when you're uncertain. Step 4. Practice sacred detachment. This is the core of Montaigne's quiet genius. Detachment not as indifference, but as intimacy without control. You love more purely when you don't cling. You work more freely when your identity isn't shackled to the result. You express yourself more honestly when you're not obsessed with being understood. This isn't about giving up, it's about giving space. As the Stoics taught, and Montaigne admired them, you cannot control what happens, only your response to it. The rebel, therefore, doesn't suppress emotion. They simply stop letting it define their value. Try it. Next time someone disapproves of you, pause. Feel the sting. Let it pass through you. Then ask, is their opinion more important than my truth? 9 times out of 10, it won't be. Because the people who matter won't demand your mask. They'll crave your presence. Step 5. Live without the scoreboard. You've been taught to measure everything. Success, love, happiness, followers, income. But Montaigne lived without metrics. He didn't seek fame. In fact, he rarely left his estate. He wasn't trying to build a legacy. He was trying to be real. This is your final act of rebellion. Stop living like life is a resume. Let your worth be unquantifiable. Don't do it for applause. Do it for aliveness. Write without worrying who will read. Laugh without worrying how you look. Leave the text unread. Say no without a reason. Meditate not to become calm, but to become aware. This kind of living confuses people. It threatens systems built on fear. It makes you untouchable, not because nothing can hurt you, but because you are no longer ruled by the need to be seen a certain way. You will still feel pain. You will still face rejection, but you will face it as you, not as the version you created to survive. And that is everything. Because when you stop caring in the right way, something strange happens. You don't become less alive. You become real. You become someone who no longer needs to manipulate life to make it meaningful. Someone who can finally exhale. Someone who has stepped out of the game, not in defeat, but in quiet, luminous defiance. This is Montaigne's gift, not a guidebook, not a formula, but a whisper through time. You are allowed to let go. You are allowed to be free, and once you taste that freedom, the world will never look the same again. There comes a moment, quiet, almost unremarkable, when you stop. You're not angry, you're not sad, you're not even resisting anymore. You've simply reached a point where the game you've been playing, chasing worth, image, approval, falls silent. And in that sudden quiet, something stirs. Not a thought, but a recognition. A truth you've known all along, but never dared to trust. You were never supposed to become someone. You were only supposed to be. This realization doesn't explode. It doesn't save you in a dramatic arc or burn your past away in holy fire. It seeps in like rain into cracked soil. And then everything begins to bloom differently. You no longer care what they think. Not because you've hardened, but because you've softened into something deeper than perception. You no longer strive to impress. Not because you've stopped trying, but because you've remembered there's nothing to prove. You no longer fear being misunderstood, because you've finally understood yourself. This is what Montaigne arrived at, not through conquest, but through surrender. He gave up the illusion of mastery and instead embraced the radical honesty of self-exploration. He wrote not to teach the world, but to tell the truth about his own strange, ever-changing soul. And in doing so, he discovered the final paradox. When you stop caring, everything falls into place, not because life suddenly becomes easy, but because you no longer resist its imperfection. This is not a slogan, it's a spiritual architecture. Let's break it open. The death of the false self. You've spent years constructing a self, building the resume of your identity, defining yourself by roles: student, partner, achiever, rebel. You've edited yourself for applause, streamlined your emotions for approval, abandoned your confusion because the world fears the ambiguous. But all that effort was aimed at one false premise, that you must become someone worthy. Worthy of love, of success, of safety. But Montaigne's writings, meandering, personal, riddled with contradictions, offer a different vision. They say, you are not here to become impressive. You are here to become intimate with your experience. And this means letting the false self die, letting the version of you who always tries to say the right thing, think the right thought, feel the right emotion, dissolve. Letting the masks slide off one by one until what's left is raw and unfinished and real. Yes, it's terrifying, but it's also sacred, because only when you stop performing do you begin participating in life. The permission to be ordinary. The world tells you to be exceptional, to rise above, to chase legacy. But what if you don't need to be remembered? What if you just need to exist fully now? Montaigne wasn't extraordinary by most standards. He didn't invent a system. He didn't lead a movement. He wasn't even consistent in his own beliefs. But he lived truthfully. And that truth, unfiltered, messy, curious, is what survived. He showed us that the soul doesn't thrive on achievement. It thrives on attention, on wonder, on presence. So stop chasing greatness. Start noticing aliveness. The way the light touches your coffee, the way your chest tightens before you speak your truth. The strange beauty of being afraid and doing it anyway. Because here's the secret. Ordinary moments deeply felt are more transcendent than extraordinary ones performed for show. The end of the search. Most of your life, you've been told that fulfillment is out there, in the next job, the next lover, the next spiritual awakening. But the chase is the lie. Montaigne stopped searching. He wrote about his fear of death not to conquer it, but to understand it. He wrote about his bowel problems, his nightmares, his fluctuating moods, not to fix them, but to honor their place in his reality. He didn't treat life as a problem to solve. He treated it as a conversation, a mystery to live inside of. So what if you stopped searching for answers? What if the questions were enough? What if, instead of fixing yourself, you simply got curious? What if you let your sadness stay for tea? What if you welcomed your contradictions to the table? What if the end of the search isn't stagnation, but stillness? The kind of stillness that whispers, you are already home. The soul after surrender. Something wild happens when you stop caring in the way the world demands. You begin to care in a way the world doesn't understand. You begin to care about the small things, the true things. The moments no one sees but that matter anyway. The way you speak to a child. The way you forgive someone who hasn't asked. The way you sit with yourself in silence, no longer afraid of what you'll find. This is soul work, not the grand, glittering kind, but the quiet, unshakable kind that roots you in the marrow of your life. This is what Montaigne practiced. And this is what you're remembering now. The final paradox. You began this journey thinking that letting go meant giving up. But now you see, letting go is the beginning of truth. You thought that caring less would make you cold. But now you feel more than ever because you're finally feeling what's real. You thought that surrender meant defeat. But now you realize it's the only way to win a game that was never yours to play. You are no longer chasing, no longer performing, no longer editing your soul for the comfort of others. You are here, naked in your honesty, free in your contradiction, alive in your not knowing. And this terrifying, magnificent, ordinary aliveness is everything you were looking for. You just didn't know how to stop running. So now what? Now you walk differently, not with arrogance, but with grace, not with certainty, but with presence. You meet life not as a critic or a brand or a seeker, but as a soul finally untethered. You no longer ask, how can I be enough? You know now you were never not enough, and everything that felt like falling apart was really just falling into place.